On the morning of her 40th birthday, Claire Whitfield woke up to the smell of coffee she hadn't made and a house that felt, for the first time in 11 years, like it belonged to someone else. Her husband, Daniel, was already dressed. Not in his usual weekend clothes, but in the charcoal suit he wore for closings, the one that meant money was about to change hands, one way or another. He kissed her forehead the way you'd stamp a package. Quick. Efficient. Done. Happy birthday, he said. I have something for you. Open it tonight. After dinner. Claire smiled and told him she couldn't wait. She was lying. She had stopped being able to read Daniel's face 2 years ago, but she had gotten very good at reading everything else, his calendar, his second phone, the storage unit he thought she didn't know about on Route 9. She already knew what was in the box wrapped in gold paper sitting on the hallway console table. She'd known for 6 days. It was not jewelry. Daniel Whitfield was 52 years old, a partner at a mid-sized commercial real estate firm in the suburbs of Hartford, Connecticut, and a man who had spent the last 3 years quietly convincing himself that his wife was an obstacle rather than a person. He believed, with the particular arrogance of men who have never once been caught, that Claire was exactly what she appeared to be, a former high school English teacher who'd left her career to raise their son, manage the household, and support his rise. Pleasant. Predictable. Unaware. He had no idea that 6 days earlier, Claire had let herself into his study while he was supposedly at a conference in Boston, a conference that, according to the hotel's own website, did not exist that weekend, and found a manila folder tucked behind his tax documents. Inside it, a draft divorce petition, already reviewed by an attorney named Gregory Pham, citing irreconcilable differences, and a financial disclosure statement that dramatically understated Daniel's actual assets. Off by roughly $2.3 million. Claire had stood in that study for a long time, longer than she'd meant to, listening to the house settle around her the way it always did in the late afternoon. She had photographed every page with her phone, careful to keep the folder's contents in their original order. Then she had put it back exactly as she found it, straightened the corner of the rug he always kicked askew on his way to the desk, and gone downstairs to make dinner, because Owen had practice at 6 and someone had to make sure there was food on the table before then. Life, she had already learned by that point, does not pause politely for the moment you find out who your husband really is. The day of her birthday unfolded the way most of their days unfolded now, pleasant on the surface, hollow underneath. Daniel took her to lunch at the restaurant where they'd had their first anniversary dinner, ordered a bottle of wine he barely touched, and spent most of the meal checking a phone he angled just slightly away from her, the way men do when they've had 2 years of practice. Claire asked about his day. He said it was fine. She asked about a client he'd mentioned the week before. He seemed surprised she remembered, which told her more than he probably intended it to. That evening, after a dinner Daniel barely touched and a bottle of wine he drank most of himself, he slid the box across the table. Open it, he said, and there was something in his voice Claire had never heard directed at her before. Not affection. Relief. The sound of a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying too long and was tired of pretending not to feel. She untied the ribbon slowly, aware of him watching her hands, aware of him wanting this to be quick. Lifted the lid. Looked down at the crisp legal document on top, her name typed in cold serif font. In re the marriage of Daniel R. Whitfield and Claire M. Whitfield. Daniel watched her face, waiting for it to crumble. It didn't. Thank you, Claire said quietly, closing the box like she'd been handed a scarf she wasn't sure matched her coat. This is very thoughtful, Daniel. His confidence flickered for exactly 1 second. Just long enough for Claire to see it, and long enough for her to understand that some part of him, some small, cowardly part, had actually expected tears. Had wanted them, maybe, as proof that he still mattered enough to wound her. Then he recovered, cleared his throat, and told her they'd handle everything amicably. He'd already spoken to a lawyer. He'd be moving into the Farmington condo, the one Claire had also already found out about, 3 weeks earlier, from a change of address confirmation email he'd forgotten to delete from a shared laptop, by the end of the month. He hoped she'd be reasonable. Claire looked at her husband of 11 years, the father of her son, the man who had once cried at their wedding when her father walked her down the aisle, and felt something settle inside her that was neither grief nor rage. It was clarity. Cold and complete. The kind that only comes after you've spent a long time refusing to look directly at something true. "I'll be very reasonable," she said. "You'll see." He took that as surrender. It was the opposite. It was the sound of a door quietly closing on the last version of herself who might have begged. To understand what happened over the next 4 months, you have to understand who Claire Whitfield actually was, not the woman Daniel had flattened into wife and mother in his own mind, but the woman underneath that, the one he'd stopped bothering to ask about somewhere around their 8th anniversary. Before she was Mrs. Whitfield, Claire Bennett had graduated top of her class from a state university with a double major in English and economics, the economics degree a small, private rebellion against a high school guidance counselor who'd told her, at 17, that numbers weren't really her thing and steered her toward the humanities without ever asking what she actually wanted. She'd spent 2 years after college working as a paralegal at a boutique litigation firm in Boston, saving aggressively, living in a studio apartment with a mattress on the floor and a stack of borrowed finance textbooks on the nightstand, quietly building a small stock portfolio her friends teased her about because she read annual reports the way other people read magazines, for pleasure, and because she wanted, badly, to understand how money actually moved in the world instead of just watching it move around her. Then she met Daniel. He was charming in the specific way ambitious men are charming when they still need something from you, attentive, curious about her opinions, generous with his time, quick to tell her she was the smartest person in whatever room they were standing in. Claire fell for him the way smart people sometimes do, not blindly, but because for those first few years, he genuinely was who he pretended to be. He asked her opinion on his early deals. He listened, actually listened, when she flagged a clause in a contract that his own junior associates had missed. For a while, they were partners in the fullest sense of the word. They married in a small ceremony her father paid for, against Daniel's mild objection that they should do something bigger, more befitting where we're headed. Their son, Owen, was born 2 years later. Claire left the paralegal job, her choice, she told herself at the time, though later she'd wonder how much of that choice had been quietly engineered by 100 small comments from Daniel about how it just made more financial sense for her to stay home while his career took off, and how tired she'd been, in those early years, of arguing against a version of practicality that always seemed to cost her something and him nothing. What Daniel never fully registered, because men like Daniel rarely audit the people who orbit them once those people stop being useful to their ego, was that Claire never actually stopped. She managed the household budget down to the dollar, tracking every expense in a spreadsheet Daniel had glanced at exactly once, years ago, and never looked at again. She quietly kept her paralegal license active with continuing education credits, telling Daniel it was just a hobby, something to keep her brain sharp between school pickups. She'd taken over managing her late father's small rental property portfolio 5 years earlier, 3 modest multi-family buildings in a town 40 minutes away that her father had built up slowly over 3 decades as a working accountant, and she ran them efficiently and profitably without ever mentioning the actual numbers to her husband, because Daniel had made it clear, early and often, that he found your dad's little houses beneath his professional interests, a distraction, at best, from what he considered real money. That omission would matter enormously later. But Claire didn't know that yet, either. She had simply, instinctively, kept one door in her life that Daniel had never bothered to walk through, the way people sometimes keep a spare key hidden somewhere without quite admitting to themselves why. And in the 2 years leading up to her birthday, when the sign started, the second phone that lived in his gym bag instead of his pocket, the unexplained late nights that stretched from 1 evening a week to 3, the new cologne that didn't smell like anything he'd ever chosen for himself before, the way he'd started referring to my money instead of our money in offhand comments at dinner, Claire hadn't confronted him. She had done what she'd been trained to do as a paralegal, and what her father, a quiet, meticulous accountant who had never once raised his voice in her presence, had trained into her without either of them realizing it at the time. She had started building a file. Her name was Vanessa Cole, and she was 34 years old, a marketing director at the same firm where Daniel was a partner. Claire had met her exactly twice, once at a holiday party, where Vanessa had complimented Claire's dress with the overly warm enthusiasm of a woman who knows exactly what she's doing and wants credit for the effort, and once at Owen's 10th birthday party, where Daniel had inexplicably invited a few people from the office and Vanessa had shown up in white jeans to a backyard barbecue, standing near the drinks table with the slightly too careful posture of someone who had rehearsed being casual. Claire hadn't needed a private investigator to piece it together, though eventually she hired one anyway, a quiet, unglamorous woman named Renata Ford who specialized in financial infidelity cases and charged by the hour with the flat efficiency of someone who had seen 1,000 versions of the same story and no longer found any of them shocking. What Renata confirmed over 6 patient weeks of work was worse than an affair. It was a plan. Daniel and Vanessa had been involved for just under 2 years. But more importantly, and this was the detail that made Claire's hands go cold the first time she read Renata's report at her kitchen table, alone, after Owen had gone to bed, Daniel had been slowly, deliberately restructuring his finances since almost the exact month the affair began. He had moved his equity stake in a lucrative mixed-use development project, the Arden on Fifth, into a holding LLC registered solely in his own name, using a legal maneuver his own firm handled routinely for wealthy clients trying to shield assets from creditors, lawsuits, or, though no one ever said this part out loud, spouses. It was called a buyout and reissue, and a technically converted marital property acquired during the marriage into an asset that looked, on paper, like a pre-existing personal investment, provided no one looked too closely at the timing or the valuation used. He had opened 2 accounts at a bank 40 miles from their home, in a town they had no connection to, no client relationships, no reason to ever visit, and been quietly funneling bonus income into them for 18 months instead of running it through the joint account the way he had every year prior. He had let his life insurance policy lapse, a policy that had named Claire and Owen as beneficiaries for a decade, and quietly taken out a new one, with a new provider, listing Vanessa Cole as the sole beneficiary. And 6 weeks before Claire's birthday, he had put a deposit down, in cash, on a lakefront property in New Hampshire, a 4-bedroom house with a private dock that Renata had photographed from the public road, its listing still faintly visible in an old real estate archive. 2 names appeared on the offer letter: Daniel Whitfield and Vanessa Cole. He was not simply leaving his marriage. He was leaving it broke, quietly, legally, and with a plan already in motion to build a new life on the assets he'd stripped from the old one, all while betting, with the specific overconfidence of a man who had never once been wrong about anything that mattered to him, that Claire, the sweet stay-at-home mom who didn't really understand finances, would be too devastated and too outmatched to notice, let alone fight back. He had underestimated exactly one thing. Claire had married a man who thought numbers weren't her thing. She had never once bothered to correct him. It had never occurred to her that his blindness might one day become the exact instrument of her defense. The morning after her birthday, Daniel left for work whistling, some tuneless little melody Claire hadn't heard from him in years, the sound of a man who believes the hardest part of something is already behind him. Claire made Owen breakfast, drove him to school, listened to him talk about a science project with the kind of undivided attention she was determined never to let this situation steal from her son, and then came home. She sat down at her kitchen table with her laptop, a legal pad, and the calm, methodical focus she used to bring to grading a stack of essays on a Sunday night. Except this time, the subject under review was her own life. And she intended to earn an A. Her first call was to a family law attorney, not the friendly local one Daniel assumed she'd use if it ever came to this, the one whose firm sponsored the town's 4th of July fireworks and handled every routine divorce within a 20-mile radius, but a sharp, understated litigator named Priya Nair, who specialized in complex marital asset cases involving business owners and hidden income. Claire had found her name 18 months earlier during a quiet afternoon of research Daniel never knew about, tucked into a browser tab she closed the moment she heard his car in the driveway, and had been paying a small monthly retainer out of the rental property income ever since, telling herself it was simply prudent, the way you keep a fire extinguisher in a kitchen you hope never catches fire. Walk me through everything, Priya said, in their first real strategy session, in an office with none of the mahogany and leather theater Claire had expected, just a plain desk and a woman who listened like she was building a case in real time. Don't leave anything out because you think it's small. Small things are usually where these men hide the big things. Claire didn't leave anything out. She laid out Renata's report. The Arden on Fifth restructuring. The out-of-town bank accounts. The new life insurance policy. The lakefront deposit with Vanessa's name on it. Priya listened without interrupting, occasionally making a note in small, precise handwriting, and when Claire finished, she set her pen down and looked at her client for a long moment. He handed you divorce papers as a gift, Priya said slowly, using a financial disclosure that's off by over $2 million, 4 months after opening secret accounts and 6 weeks after putting a deposit on a house with his girlfriend. Claire, he didn't just make a mistake. He committed marital fraud. That's not just going to affect the divorce settlement. Depending on how his firm structured that Arden LLC transfer, this might not just be a civil problem for him. Claire had suspected this. Hearing it said out loud, in a lawyer's plain, unhurried voice, still landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending small ripples through a calm she'd worked very hard to build. I want 2 things, Claire said, after a moment. I want what's legally mine. And I want him to understand, at some point before this is over, that he was never actually smarter than me. He just assumed he was, and I let him, because it was easier. Priya smiled, the first real smile of the meeting, sharp at the edges. Then we're going to need a very specific kind of forensic accountant. And Claire, you're going to need to stay exactly as calm as you are right now for the next several months. This will move slowly. It will test you. Can you do that? I raised a 10-year-old and managed his father's ego for 11 years, Claire said. I can do calm. Calm is the only language I have left that he can't take from me. What followed was, from Daniel's perspective, the smoothest divorce he could have hoped for. Claire didn't scream. She didn't call Vanessa. She didn't post anything online, didn't tell her sister the ugly details over wine, didn't even cry in front of him, which unsettled him far more than tears would have, though he never let himself sit long enough with that discomfort to ask why. She agreed, on the surface, to keep things amicable. She let him believe she was overwhelmed, a little lost, deferring to him on paperwork timelines since he understood this stuff better. She even, at his suggestion, agreed to use a single mediator instead of dueling attorneys for the simple stuff, never once mentioning that Priya Nair was reviewing every document that came out of that mediation within 24 hours, cross-referencing it line by line against the disclosure Claire had photographed months earlier. Daniel, for his part, grew increasingly confident with every week that passed without incident. He moved into the Farmington condo in early spring, a sleek one-bedroom with floor-to-ceiling windows he'd once shown Claire a photo of, apparently forgetting, or not caring, that showing your soon-to-be ex-wife the apartment you're moving into with someone else is not the gesture of a man being careful. He started, carelessly, letting Vanessa answer his phone when Claire called about Owen's schedule, her voice bright and slightly too friendly, as though the 3 of them were already one big modern family instead of the wreckage of one. He told friends at the firm, some of whom, uncomfortably, still had dinners with Claire, still asked after Owen, still occasionally let something slip they didn't realize was slipping, that the divorce was going well, honestly, better than I expected, Claire's being really mature about it. What Daniel didn't know was that every casual overconfidence, every sloppy detail, every time he name-dropped a number in front of Owen that didn't match what he'd disclosed to the mediator, was being logged. Claire kept a notebook, an actual paper notebook, deliberately low-tech, sitting in a drawer no forensic subpoena would ever think to look for because it never touched a device, never synced to a cloud, never left a digital trail of its own, where she wrote down dates, numbers, and small contradictions with the same discipline she'd once used grading essays for logical consistency. A bonus figure Daniel mentioned to Owen that was $40,000 higher than what he'd disclosed to the mediator. A comment about the lake house that Owen repeated at dinner, confused, because his father had told him it was just a place we're looking at, present tense, weeks after the deposit had already gone through. Meanwhile, Renata Ford's investigation deepened, patient and unhurried. The forensic accountant Priya brought in, a meticulous man named Arthur Speck who had spent 15 years untangling exactly this kind of quiet, arrogant fraud and who kept a small model sailboat on his desk that he said reminded him everything eventually surfaces if you're patient enough. Traced the Arden on Fifth transfer back through 3 separate paper entities and found what Daniel had been careless enough to assume no one would ever look for. The buyout price used to move his equity stake into the Solo LLC had been drastically underreported, a full 40% below the property's appraised value at the time of transfer. Which under the law of the state they lived in, made the transfer legally voidable as a fraudulent conveyance designed to defeat a spouse's marital claim. In other words, the asset Daniel believed he had successfully hidden wasn't hidden at all. It was, legally, still marital property. And now there was a paper trail proving he knew it, dated and timestamped, sitting in a folder on Priya Nair's desk that Daniel had no idea existed. The first sign Daniel had that something was wrong came on an unremarkable Tuesday in June, 4 months after the birthday, when his firm's compliance department called him into an unscheduled meeting he'd assumed, walking in, was about something else entirely, a client onboarding issue, maybe, or a routine license renewal. It wasn't Claire who triggered it, not directly, not in any way Daniel could immediately trace back to her. It was a routine internal audit, the kind commercial real estate firms run periodically on partner-held entities, that flagged the Arden on Fifth transfer for review after a due diligence team working a refinancing deal on the same property pulled comparable appraisals and noticed the discrepancy Arthur Speck had already quietly documented for Priya Nair months earlier. What Daniel didn't know, what he wouldn't know for another 6 weeks, was that Priya, following a very specific and very legal strategy she and Claire had discussed for weeks, had submitted a formal discovery request in the divorce case demanding full documentation of the Arden transfer, including its original appraisal. That request had landed on his firm's general counsel's desk the same week as the internal audit, and general counsel, alarmed at the coincidence and unwilling to let a partner's personal mess become the firm's liability, had opened their own inquiry into whether Daniel had used firm resources or firm-adjacent entities to improperly shield personal assets, a potential violation of his partnership agreement, entirely separate from anything happening quietly in family court. Daniel walked out of that meeting pale in a way his colleagues would later describe, in the careful, gossiping way people describe things once someone has fallen, as not like him at all. He called Vanessa first, his voice low and fast in the parking garage. Then, uncharacteristically, hands still shaking slightly, he called Claire. "Did you do something?" he asked, his voice tight in a way Claire had heard exactly twice before in 11 years of marriage, once when his mother died, once when a deal he'd spent a year building collapsed overnight. Both times he'd sounded like a man watching the floor disappear beneath him. "I filed for what's legally mine, Daniel," Claire said, standing at her kitchen counter, her voice perfectly, devastatingly calm, the calm she had been practicing for 4 months. "That's all I've done. I'd suggest you talk to your lawyer about the rest." She hung up before he could respond. Then she sat at her kitchen table, hands slightly unsteady for the first time in 4 months, and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to feel something, not triumph yet, not quite, but the particular, bone-deep relief of a woman who has spent 2 years being quietly underestimated finally watching the scales begin, very slowly, to tip. Then she made herself tea, picked Owen up from baseball practice, and asked him about his day like nothing in the world had changed, because for Owen, at least for now, nothing had. That, more than anything else in the entire ordeal, was the thing Claire was proudest of, in the end. That her son never once had to carry the weight of what his father had done, because she had made sure, every single day, to carry it for him. Vanessa Cole had not signed up for scandal. She had signed up for a story, the story Daniel told her, over 2 years of quiet dinners and hotel rooms and increasingly serious conversations about a future together, in which his marriage was a lifeless formality he was trapped in out of obligation, his wife an incurious homemaker who'd checked out years ago and wouldn't even notice him gone, and his fortune substantial, secure, and soon to be entirely, cleanly his to share with someone who actually appreciated him. The lakefront house in New Hampshire had been, to Vanessa, the proof that the story was real. A deposit. two names. A future with an address, something solid to hold on to during the long months of waiting for Daniel to be free. It took the firm's internal investigation exactly 9 days to reach Vanessa's desk, because the due diligence team that flagged the appraisal discrepancy included a junior analyst who reported, dutifully and without any personal stake in the matter, that Vanessa's name appeared on a property purchase alongside a partner currently under review for asset concealment during an active divorce. HR opened a parallel inquiry into a possible undisclosed conflict of interest between a senior partner and a subordinate employee. The affair itself, once purely personal, was now also, suddenly, a corporate liability with her name attached to it in black and white. Vanessa was placed on administrative leave within the week, escorted out of the building with a small box of her desk belongings by a security guard who wouldn't quite meet her eyes. She called Daniel 11 times that first day. He answered twice, both times distracted, both times more concerned with his own unraveling than with hers, talking over her about lawyers and appraisals and how bad this could get for me without once asking how it might get bad for her too. And somewhere in the second call, standing alone in her apartment with the box of desk belongings still unopened on the counter, Vanessa Cole heard, for the first time with real clarity, exactly what kind of man she had built a life around. Not a man escaping a loveless marriage into something honest and new. A man who hid money from one woman and would, inevitably, given enough time, hide it from the next. She didn't warn Claire. She didn't need to. But 3 weeks later, when Priya Nair's office received an unsolicited, carefully worded email from a personal account, no signature, but an attached bank statement showing a wire transfer from Daniel's out-of-town account into a joint account opened under both his and Vanessa's names 2 weeks before the birthday, Claire understood exactly what had happened, and exactly why. Somewhere along the way, the woman Daniel had chosen instead of her had finally seen him clearly too. Hell, as it turned out, had several very useful accountants in it, and at least one very disillusioned ally. Daniel walked into what he still believed would be a routine mediation session in late July with the practiced calm of a man used to controlling every room he entered, dressed in the same charcoal suit he'd worn the morning he handed Claire the box, as though he hadn't noticed, or hadn't cared, that it was the same suit. He had, by this point, quietly retained a second attorney, a more aggressive one than the mediation-friendly lawyer who'd drafted the original papers, because his firm's internal investigation had made him nervous enough to want real teeth on his side, though he still, somehow, believed the worst of it was behind him. He did not know that Priya Nair had, 3 days earlier, filed a motion converting the case from mediation to formal litigation, citing evidence of fraudulent asset transfer, undisclosed marital income, and material misrepresentation on his financial disclosure. And that the motion, along with every supporting document Arthur Speck had compiled over 4 painstaking months, was sitting in the folder in front of Priya's seat at the conference table, tabbed and organized with the precision of a woman who had never once, in her career, walked into a room unprepared. He also did not know that Claire, sitting quietly beside her attorney in a plain gray dress, had spent the morning not anxious, but steady, the way she used to feel walking into a classroom on the day of a final exam she knew her students weren't ready for, and she absolutely was. The mediator opened the session with the usual pleasantries. Daniel's new attorney opened with an aggressive framing about moving this along efficiently for both parties, given how amicable things have been. And then Priya Nair opened her folder. She walked through it methodically, document by document, giving Daniel no room to interrupt without looking like exactly what he was. The original disclosure statement, understated by $2.3 million. The Arden on Fifth transfer, priced 40% below appraised value, a transfer completed, notably, 11 days after Daniel had first consulted his divorce attorney, which under the law made it not just undervalued but timed in a way that gutted any claim it was unrelated to the marriage's end. The out-of-town accounts, opened 18 months earlier, funded quietly and consistently since. The lapsed and reissued life insurance policy, now naming a woman who was not his wife. The lakefront deposit, 2 names on an offer letter. And finally, the bank statement Vanessa had anonymously provided, showing the wire transfer 2 weeks before the birthday gift, proof that Daniel had been actively moving joint marital funds into a jointly titled account with another woman while still legally married to Claire. Daniel's new attorney, to his credit, went pale enough that even the mediator noticed and quietly slid a glass of water toward him. He asked for a recess before Priya had finished the third document, his voice tight and clipped in a way that told everyone in the room exactly how much worse this was than he'd been led to believe. In the hallway outside the conference room, Daniel grabbed Claire's arm, not violently, but with the desperate grip of a drowning man reaching for anything solid, and said, low and furious, his composure finally, completely gone. "What did you do?" Claire looked down at his hand until he let go. Then she looked up at him, and for the first time in 4 months, let him see exactly how long she had known. "I gave you a very quiet, very reasonable divorce, Daniel," she said. "The same way you gave me a very quiet, very cruel gift. I just happened to actually read the paperwork before I signed anything. You should try that sometime." What happened over the next 8 weeks unfolded with the particular, grim inevitability of a structure that had been rotted from the inside long before anyone noticed the cracks spreading across the paint. The firm's internal investigation concluded that Daniel had used firm-affiliated legal entities to improperly restructure personal assets in a manner that violated both his partnership agreement and, more seriously, exposed the firm to potential liability given the undervalued appraisal used in the transfer, an appraisal that, it turned out, one of the firm's own junior associates had signed off on without realizing what it would later be used for. Daniel was asked to resign his partnership rather than face a formal ethics proceeding, a resignation that, once the details inevitably leaked, effectively ended his career in commercial real estate in a market small enough that everyone would eventually hear the real reason, whispered over coffee at industry conferences for years to come. In family court, the fraudulent conveyance finding on the Arden on Fifth transfer meant the asset was restored, in full, to the marital estate, meaning Claire, rather than losing her claim to it as Daniel had planned, was now entitled to an equitable share of an asset he had assumed was entirely, invisibly his, an asset worth, at current valuation, well over $3 million. Combined with the understated disclosure, the hidden accounts, and the documented pattern of dissipating marital assets on an affair, hotels, gifts, a cash deposit on a house, the judge awarded Claire a settlement considerably more favorable than what a standard 50-50 split would have produced, along with a finding that Daniel would bear the substantial legal fees Claire had incurred proving the fraud. A detail Priya Nair had fought for specifically because, as she told Claire afterward, men like him need to feel the cost of underestimating someone in a language they actually understand. Vanessa Cole did not lose her job outright. The affair itself, ultimately, wasn't technically the violation, but she resigned 2 months later anyway, unable to walk the halls of a firm that had watched her personal life become a cautionary tale traded in the break room. The lakefront property deal in New Hampshire quietly fell through when the seller, made aware through public court filings of the buyer's unraveling finances, exercised a contingency clause and returned the property to the market within the week. Vanessa was not on the deed of anything, in the end. She had given 2 years of her life to a man's promise and walked away with nothing but a lesson she'd likely spend a long time metabolizing, alone, in a smaller apartment than the one she'd imagined for herself by the water. And Daniel Whitfield, who had once believed himself 3 moves ahead of a wife he'd stopped truly looking at years earlier, found himself, at 52, unemployed in his field, publicly humiliated among a professional circle that talks, paying a settlement nearly double what he'd hoped to escape with, and living alone in a Farmington condo that suddenly felt much smaller than it had when he'd first signed the lease with someone else's future in mind. He had wanted to leave his marriage quietly, cleanly, and rich. He left it loudly, publicly, and considerably poorer than when he'd started, undone not by a scorned, hysterical wife, as he'd once, cruelly, described her to Vanessa in a moment Claire would later read, unflinching, in a deposition transcript, but by a woman who had simply never stopped paying attention, long after he'd decided it was safe to assume she wasn't. Claire didn't celebrate the way people expect, in these stories, to celebrate. There was no dramatic confrontation scene, no viral moment, no champagne toast on a courthouse lawn. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic, a signature on a settlement document, a quiet drive home with the radio on low, a stop at the grocery store on the way because Owen needed cereal for the morning and life, again, refused to pause for the significance of the moment. What she did do, in the year that followed, was build something real out of what she'd spent a decade quietly protecting and preparing, brick by brick, long before she ever knew she'd need it. She used part of her settlement, along with the rental income she'd managed so carefully for years without her husband ever once asking to see the numbers, to expand her father's small property portfolio, buying 2 additional multifamily buildings in the same town, this time not as a quiet side project she downplayed at dinner parties, but as the foundation of a real, named business. Bennett Property Group. Registered proudly under her maiden name, the name her father had built his own quiet, careful life around. She let her paralegal license lapse into something more purposeful, enrolling part-time in a program to become a licensed real estate broker, drawing on 11 years of watching her ex-husband's industry from the outside with a clarity he'd never given her credit for, taking notes at industry events he would have once dismissed her from attending. Within 18 months, she wasn't just managing 3 inherited buildings. She was closing deals of her own, sitting across negotiating tables from men who had no idea, at first, how carefully she'd read every clause before she signed anything. Owen split time between 2 households, and Claire made sure, deliberately and consistently, that he never heard a bitter word about his father from her, not because she'd forgiven Daniel, exactly, but because she understood, with the same clear-eyed discipline that had carried her through the entire ordeal, that Owen's peace was worth more than her own satisfaction in being proven right. She let him love his father in whatever complicated way he needed to, and she never once made him choose. As for Daniel, the last anyone in their old circle heard, he'd taken a smaller role at a regional firm 2 states away, quietly rebuilding a career and a reputation from a much lower floor than the one he'd started on, and dating, briefly and unsuccessfully, a string of women who eventually, in one way or another, seemed to hear enough about his past to move on. He and Claire spoke, when they had to, about Owen's schedule and nothing else, cordial, brief, entirely without the smugness that had once colored every one of his sentences, the smugness of a man who had believed, right up until the very end, that he was the only one in the marriage who understood how the world actually worked. Claire Whitfield, she kept the name, in the end, deciding somewhere along the way that it belonged to her now as much as it ever had to him, and that giving it up would have felt like one more thing surrendered to a man who'd already tried to take everything else, stood, a little over a year after her 40th birthday, in the small, sunlit office of Bennett Property Group, looking over the numbers on her 4th building acquisition, the pages spread across a desk that was entirely, unambiguously hers. She thought, sometimes, about the gold-wrapped box on the hallway console table. About the second it took Daniel's confidence to flicker when she hadn't cried. About how certain he had been, right up until the very end, that he understood exactly who he was married to. He never had. And by the time he finally did, sitting alone in a condo he could no longer really afford, reading a court filing that dismantled every quiet assumption he'd ever made about the woman he'd once promised to spend his life with, it was far, far too late to matter. Claire closed the folder on her desk, looked out at the late afternoon light falling across a street she now, in more ways than one, owned a piece of, and allowed herself, finally, a small, private smile. Not for revenge. For proof. Proof that the woman he'd underestimated for 11 years had been there all along, quietly building something he never once thought to ask about. Claire Whitfield, she kept the name, in the end, deciding somewhere along the way that it belonged to her now as much as it ever had to him, and that giving it up would have felt like one more thing surrendered to a man who'd already tried to take everything else. She stood, a little over a year after her 40th birthday, in the small, sunlit office of Bennett Property Group, looking over the numbers on her 4th building acquisition, the pages spread across a desk that was entirely, unambiguously hers. She thought, sometimes, about the gold-wrapped box on the hallway console table. About the second it took Daniel's confidence to flicker when she hadn't cried. About how certain he had been, right up until the very end, that he understood exactly who he was married to. He never had. And by the time he finally did, sitting alone in a condo he could no longer really afford, reading a court filing that dismantled every quiet assumption he'd ever made about the woman he'd once promised to spend his life with, it was far, far too late to matter. Claire closed the folder on her desk, looked out at the late afternoon light falling across a street she now, in more ways than one, owned a piece of, and allowed herself, finally, a small, private smile. Not for revenge. For proof. Proof that the woman he'd underestimated for 11 years had been there all along, quietly building something he never once thought to ask about.